A federal courtroom in Brooklyn. Henry Hill sat in the witness box, hands folded, eyes scanning the room. Across from him, his former crew, the men he'd hijacked trucks with, buried bodies with, made millions with. They stared back, cold, murderous, silent. But Henry wasn't alone. Standing near the prosecutor's table was the man who'd convinced him to flip, Edward McDonald. 39 years old, sharp suit, sharper mind. He was the assistant U.S. attorney who dismantled the Lucchese crime family brick by brick. And 5 years later, he'd do something no federal prosecutor had ever done. He'd play himself in a movie. Not as a consultant, as an actor. In the final scene of Goodfellas, when Henry and Karen Hill sit across from the feds and agree to cooperate, that's not an actor playing Edward McDonald. That's Edward McDonald, playing himself, delivering the same speech he'd given dozens of times in real life. This is the story of the FBI agent who became a character in his own legend. The man who turned mobsters into informants, prosecuted organized crime's biggest names, and then crossed into Hollywood to immortalize the moment that changed everything. But here's what the history books don't tell you. McDonald didn't just flip Henry Hill. He flipped Michael Franzese, one of the wealthiest mobsters in American history. And decades later, he defended Franzese when other prosecutors came after him. The same man who destroyed the mob became the mob's lawyer. How does that happen? And what did McDonald know about the Mafia that made him the most dangerous opponent they ever faced? Edward McDonald was born in 1951 in Queens, New York. Irish Catholic family, blue-collar roots. His father was a cop. That detail matters. Growing up in a house where law enforcement was the family business meant McDonald understood something early. The system worked when good men fought for it. He went to Boston College, then Georgetown Law. By 1976, he was a federal prosecutor in the Eastern District of New York. 25 years old, ambitious, hungry, and assigned to the organized crime strike force. This wasn't some desk job reviewing tax fraud. This was the front lines. The Eastern District covered Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, Long Island Mafia heartland. 5 families operated openly. They controlled unions, construction, garbage collection, the Fulton Fish Market, JFK Airport cargo. The mob wasn't hiding. They were the infrastructure. McDonald's job? Dismantle it. He started small, low-level extortion cases, loan sharking. But he studied the structure. He read wiretap transcripts like literature. He learned the language. Cosa Nostra didn't just mean our thing. It meant a code, a hierarchy, a system that survived because it was disciplined. McDonald realized something crucial. You couldn't arrest your way out of this. You had to flip them, turn insiders into witnesses, use their own words against them, use their own rules to destroy them. The Mafia's greatest strength was omertà, the code of silence. McDonald decided to break it, one informant at a time. His first major case came in 1978, the Lufthansa heist, December 11th. $6 million in cash and jewelry stolen from a Lufthansa cargo building at JFK. It was the largest cash robbery in American history at the time. The crew? Jimmy Burke, Tommy DeSimone, Henry Hill, Angelo Seppi, and a network of Lucchese associates. The FBI knew who did it within weeks. They had informants. They had surveillance. They had motive and opportunity. But they had no evidence, no witnesses, no confessions. Burke had killed most of the crew to cover his tracks. By 1979, 8 people connected to the heist were dead. Burke wasn't getting caught until Henry Hill got arrested on a drug charge. May 16, 1980. Narcotics agents raided Hill's house in Rockville Center, Long Island. They found cocaine, quaaludes, and a trafficking operation tied to Pittsburgh. Hill was facing 25 years. He was 47 years old. He had a wife and 2 kids. He'd spent his entire adult life in the mob. And now he was looking at dying in prison. But Hill had one thing Burke didn't: leverage. He knew details, dates, names, bank accounts, murder sites. And he knew the one man who could make a deal: Edward MacDonald. MacDonald didn't trust Hill at first. Nobody did. Hill was a liar, a drug addict, and a criminal who'd do anything to save himself. But MacDonald also knew something about informants. They don't flip because they grow a conscience. They flip because they're trapped. And Hill was trapped. MacDonald met with Hill and his wife Karen in a conference room at the U.S. Attorney's office in Brooklyn. The room was small, windowless, institutional gray walls. Hill sat across from MacDonald, Karen beside him, both of them pale, exhausted, terrified. MacDonald didn't waste time. He laid it out. You cooperate. You testify. You give us everyone, and I mean everyone, or you do 25 years and your family gets nothing. Hill asked what protection looked like. MacDonald said witness protection, new identities, relocation, monthly stipend. But there was a condition: total honesty, no holding back, no lies, one lie, and the deal was off. Hill looked at Karen. She nodded. He turned back to MacDonald and said yes. What happened next changed organized crime forever. Hill didn't just testify about the Lufthansa heist. He testified about everything. 50 indictments. Convictions against Paul Vario, the Lucchese capo who'd been his mentor for 30 years. Convictions against Jimmy Burke for murder and racketeering. Testimony that exposed the inner workings of the Lucchese family's airport operations, loan sharking, extortion, drug trafficking. MacDonald had turned one mid-level associate into a wrecking ball. But it wasn't easy. Hill was a nightmare witness. He exaggerated. He embellished. He forgot details. He lied about small things, then admitted it later. MacDonald had to corroborate everything: wiretaps, bank records, forensic evidence, other witnesses. The Henry Hill testimony was just the starting point. The real case was built on documentation, and that's where MacDonald excelled. He was meticulous, obsessive. He'd spend 18-hour days reviewing phone records, tracking money transfers, interviewing cooperating witnesses. He wasn't flashy. He was relentless. The trials began in 1981. Paul Vario's case went first. Vario was 67 years old, capo in the Lucchese family. He'd run operations out of a taxi dispatch office in Brooklyn for 40 years. He controlled unions, extorted businesses, oversaw the crew that pulled the Lufthansa heist. He was old school, disciplined, careful, and he'd never been convicted of anything serious. Until Henry Hill sat on the witness stand and described in excruciating detail how Vario's operation worked: the loan sharking, the point shaving at Boston College, the airport thefts, the drug trafficking. MacDonald corroborated it all. Financial records, surveillance photos, wiretap transcripts. Vario was convicted and sentenced to 10 years. He died in prison in 1988. His empire dismantled. Jimmy Burke's trial came next. Burke was even more dangerous than Vario. He was a killer, a planner, the mastermind behind Lufthansa, and he'd spent 2 years eliminating anyone who could testify against him. But he'd made one mistake. He hadn't killed Henry Hill. Hill testified about Burke's involvement in multiple murders, the body dumping locations, the planning meetings, the payouts. But Burke wasn't convicted for Lufthansa. The murder evidence was stronger. He was sentenced to 20 years for the murder of Richard Eaton, a drug dealer Burke had killed to cover his tracks. Burke died in prison in 1996. He never saw freedom again. MacDonald's reputation grew. By 1985, he was the lead prosecutor on the organized crime strike force. He'd taken down captains, soldiers, associates. He'd flipped informants no one thought could be flipped. And then he got the case that would define his career: Michael Franzese. Michael Franzese was different. He wasn't a thug. He wasn't a killer. He was a moneymaker. The son of John Sonny Franzese, a legendary Colombo family underboss. Michael had been made at 25. By 30, He was generating $50 million a year for the Colombo family through a gas tax scheme so sophisticated it took the FBI years to understand it. Here's how it worked. Gasoline in the 1980s was taxed heavily. Federal and state taxes added up to 40 cents per gallon. Distributors were supposed to collect that tax and remit it to the government. Franzese set up shell companies that imported gasoline, sold it without paying the tax, then disappeared before the IRS could collect. He'd create a new company, repeat the process. $50 million a year in stolen tax revenue. And it was technically legal until you proved intent. McDonald spent 3 years building the case. He used IRS agents, forensic accountants, undercover operatives. He tracked shell companies through 12 states. He subpoenaed bank records from offshore accounts. And in 1985, he indicted Franzese on racketeering charges. Franzese was facing 50 years. He was 34 years old, married, 2 kids. And he'd just been named number 18 on Fortune magazine's list of the 50 most wealthy and powerful mob bosses. He had money. He had lawyers. He had the Colombo family behind him. But he also had Edward McDonald. And McDonald knew how to break people, not through threats, through logic. McDonald sat down with Franzese during pre-trial negotiations and laid out the math. You're 34. You're facing 50 years. You'll be 84 when you get out, if you get out. Your kids won't know you. Your wife will leave. The Colombo family will forget you. Or you cooperate. You testify. You give us the structure, the schemes, the names, and you do 10 years maximum. Then you rebuild your life. Franzese didn't flip immediately, but the logic worked on him. In 1986, Franzese pleaded guilty and agreed to cooperate. He gave McDonald everything: the gas scheme, the money laundering, the offshore accounts, the Colombo family's financial operations. McDonald used that testimony to indict 15 other mobsters. Franzese was sentenced to 10 years. He served 7. When he got out, he became a motivational speaker and a Christian minister. And decades later, when federal prosecutors tried to go after Franzese again for old charges, the lawyer who defended him was Edward McDonald, the same man who'd prosecuted him. That's the part of the story that doesn't make sense unless you understand McDonald. He wasn't a crusader. He wasn't on a mission to destroy the Mafia because of some personal vendetta. He was doing a job that required prosecuting criminals. And when Franzese was no longer a criminal, when he'd served his time, cooperated, and rebuilt his life, McDonald saw him as a former defendant, not an enemy. That's rare in federal prosecution. Most prosecutors spend their careers chasing convictions. McDonald spent his career chasing justice, and those aren't always the same thing. By 1988, McDonald had left the U.S. Attorney's Office. He'd spent 12 years prosecuting the mob. He'd convicted captains, soldiers, and associates from all 5 families. He'd dismantled billion-dollar operations. He'd flipped informants who'd never been flipped before, and he'd done it without ever becoming the story. He was quiet, professional, effective. He joined the law firm Deckert, LLP, and shifted to white-collar defense, corporate fraud, securities violations, the kind of cases that paid 6 figures instead of a government salary. But his mob cases followed him. In 1990, a journalist named Nicholas Pileggi published a book called Wise Guy. It was based on Henry Hill's life. Pileggi had interviewed Hill extensively, corroborated his stories with FBI files and court transcripts, and written a detailed account of the Lucchese family's operations. The book was a bestseller. And director Martin Scorsese bought the rights. He wanted to make a movie, but he needed authenticity. He needed the real voices, and he needed Edward McDonald. Scorsese approached McDonald in 1989. He wanted him to appear in the film, not as a consultant, as himself. Playing the role he'd played in real life, the prosecutor who flipped Henry Hill, McDonald was skeptical. He was a lawyer, not an actor. But Scorsese convinced him. "You know the words," Scorsese said. You've said them 100 times. Just say them again." So MacDonald agreed. The scene was filmed in a real federal courtroom in Brooklyn. MacDonald sat across from Ray Liotta, who played Henry Hill, and Lorraine Bracco, who played Karen Hill. The dialogue was almost word for word from the actual conversation MacDonald had with the Hills in 1980.
I think you
I don't
understand
know
that.
anything.
Come on, you don't know anything. Don't give me the babe in the woods routine, Karen.
I've been around long enough to know that you knew what he was doing. And don't tell me you didn't live well. You had the house, the cars, the clothes. You knew. Bracco's character protests. MacDonald's character doesn't care. It doesn't matter what you knew or when you knew it. What matters is, are you going to cooperate or not? That scene became one of the most memorable moments in Goodfellas. Not because of dramatic tension, but because it was real. MacDonald wasn't acting. He was remembering, and the audience felt it. Goodfellas was released on September 19th, 1990. It was a critical and commercial success. It earned 6 Academy Award nominations. It's now considered one of the greatest films ever made. And Edward MacDonald became the only federal prosecutor to play himself in a major Hollywood film. But he didn't capitalize on it. He didn't write a book. He didn't go on talk shows. He went back to his law practice and kept working. That's who MacDonald was. Competent, professional, uninterested in fame. But his legacy didn't end with Goodfellas. In 2015, a documentary filmmaker tracked him down for an interview. MacDonald was 64 years old by then, retired from active practice. Still sharp, still measured, the interviewer asked him about Henry Hill. MacDonald didn't sugarcoat it. Henry was a career criminal. He lied constantly. He exaggerated. He was a drug addict who would have said anything to stay out of prison. But he was also useful. He gave us details no one else could, and we corroborated everything. The testimony alone wasn't enough. It never is. You need documents. You need wiretaps. You need other witnesses. Henry opened the door. We did the rest. The interviewer asked if MacDonald had any regrets. He said no. We took down some of the most dangerous criminals in New York. We dismantled operations that had been running for decades. Did we stop organized crime? No, you can't stop it. But we hurt it. We made it harder. We made them more careful. And that's a win. MacDonald also defended his decision to later represent Michael Franzese. Michael served his time. He cooperated. He rebuilt his life. When prosecutors tried to come after him again for old charges, that wasn't justice. That was vindictive. I wasn't defending the mobster he used to be. I was defending the man he'd become. And there's a difference. That perspective is rare. Most prosecutors see defendants as permanently guilty. MacDonald saw them as people who made choices and could make different ones. What made Edward MacDonald so effective? 3 things. First, patience. He didn't rush cases. He built them brick by brick. Financial records, wiretaps, surveillance, corroborating witnesses. By the time he indicted someone, the case was airtight. Second, psychology. He understood what motivated people: greed, fear, loyalty, ego. He used those motivations to flip informants. He'd find the pressure point, usually family or prison time, and push until they broke. Third, credibility. Mobsters respected him, not because he was friendly, but because he was honest. When MacDonald made a deal, he kept it. When he made a threat, he followed through. That consistency made him dangerous. You couldn't manipulate him. You couldn't charm him. You could only deal with him on his terms. The Lucchese family never recovered from MacDonald's prosecutions. Paul Vario died in prison. Jimmy Burke died in prison. Henry Hill lived in witness protection until 2012, when he died of heart disease at 69. By then, Hill had been arrested multiple times for drunk driving, assault, and drug possession. He'd violated the terms of witness protection repeatedly. The FBI eventually cut him loose. He spent his final years doing interviews, selling paintings, and living off his Goodfellas fame. He died broke and alone in a Los Angeles hospital. That's the reality of being a rat. You survive, but you don't win. Michael Franzese, on the other hand, rebuilt his life. After serving 7 years, he left the mob completely. He married, had kids, became a motivational speaker, and wrote books about his experiences. He's now 73 years old and still active on social media, sharing stories about his time in the Colombo family. He credits Edward McDonald with giving him a second chance. "Ed could have destroyed me," Franzese said in a 2020 interview. "He could have thrown the book at me and let me rot. Instead, he gave me a deal. And when other prosecutors came after me later, he defended me. That tells you what kind of man he is. He wasn't about winning cases. He was about doing the right thing." Edward McDonald is now 73 years old. He lives in New York. He's retired from active legal practice, but still consults on white-collar cases. He doesn't do interviews often. He doesn't attend Goodfellas anniversary events. He's not interested in nostalgia. He did his job. He moved on. But his impact on organized crime prosecution is undeniable. He pioneered the use of financial forensics to build RICO cases. He developed the informant flipping strategy that every federal prosecutor now uses. He proved that you could take down the Mafia without becoming obsessed with it. You just had to be smarter than them, more patient, more disciplined. And McDonald was all three. Here's the thing about Edward McDonald. He wasn't a cowboy. He wasn't trying to be Elliot Ness. He was a prosecutor who understood that the Mafia wasn't some mythical organization. It was a business. And businesses have vulnerabilities, paper trails, bank accounts, employees who talk when the pressure's on. McDonald exploited those vulnerabilities. He turned the mob's strengths into weaknesses. Their loyalty became paranoia. Their secrecy became isolation. Their violence became evidence. And when it was over, he didn't celebrate. He just moved to the next case. The final irony? McDonald is more famous for 90 seconds in a movie than for 12 years of prosecutions. That's Hollywood. But the people who mattered knew the truth. The FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the mobsters themselves. Edward McDonald was the most dangerous opponent the Mafia faced in the 1980s, not because he was brutal, but because he was inevitable. You couldn't intimidate him. You couldn't bribe him. You couldn't outlast him. You could only lose. And eventually, they all did. So what's the lesson here? The Mafia survived for 100 years because they operated in the shadows. They controlled information. They controlled fear. They controlled loyalty. But Edward McDonald proved that none of that matters when the law is patient, when prosecutors build cases methodically, when informants flip and the structure collapses from within. The mob didn't lose because they got weaker. They lost because the people chasing them got smarter, and McDonald was the smartest one in the room. Henry Hill once said, "For as long as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster." Edward McDonald probably never thought about being a prosecutor when he was a kid, but he became one. And he was better at his job than Henry Hill ever was at his. That's the real story of Goodfellas. Not the glamour, not the violence, not the betrayal. The story is the man who sat across from Henry Hill and said, "You can cooperate or you can die in prison. Choose." And when Hill chose, McDonald did the rest. That's power. That's legacy. That's Edward McDonald. If you want to understand how the Mafia fell, don't just watch Goodfellas. Study the man who made it possible, the prosecutor who became a character in his own story, the agent who played himself, the lawyer who defended the men he once destroyed. Edward McDonald, the most important person in Goodfellas you never think about. Until now. If this story fascinated you, hit subscribe. We drop a new mob documentary every week. Drop a comment. What other untold Mafia figure should we cover next? And if you want the full story of how the Lucchese family fell apart, stick around. We're just getting started.